Today, there are 2 million descendants of French-Canadian immigrants living in New England. These are our stories. Welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Venez tous jeunes filles et garçons, je vais vous raconter l'histoire de notre immigration ici au USA, de grands aventuriers de pays étrangers.
This is the French Canadian Legacy Podcast. I am Jesse Martineau. Now, as I have mentioned in the past, one of the fun developments of the podcast has been that more and more often we get recommendations for people we should have on the show. And that is absolutely the case with the guest that joins us today. On more than one occasion, I have been asked, so when are you having Camden Martin on the show? And it was pretty funny because it was never, ever presented as an if. It was always presented as a when. So I'm glad we get to talk to him today. Camden Martin is an incredible advocate for French language education in the state of Maine. He has a crazy personal story, which I'm looking forward to getting into. He is on the board of the Alliance Française of Maine and the Franco-American Collection at the University of Southern Maine. He's currently a French teacher at a former bilingual school, which is kind of fun. Camden, welcome to the French Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Thank you very much, Jesse. I'm very happy to be with you. Thank you for that introduction.
Of course. So let's start with your story. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Auburn, but I put them together as Lewiston-Auburn here in the state of Maine.
Gotcha. Now, maybe we should just talk about that now. Because we see that all the time, Lewiston-Auburn kind of listed as though they're kind of one entity.
Yeah.
They are not one entity, correct?
They are not one entity, especially if you're from Lewiston-Auburn. You do not consider that both of them the same entity. But in the greater scheme of things, they are kind of like a one entity. I don't think everyone's going to agree with me with that, but in the greater scheme of things, at least I kind of, how could I put it? When you're from, let's say like you're in Lewiston and then they're like, oh, where you're from? And I say Auburn, then they say, oh, you're one of them.
Gotcha.
But overall, in terms of history-wise, things of Franco-American history, very, connected.
Yeah. No, do you guys on the Auburn side ever get mad that when they list the top cities, the top francophone cities, usually you see it as Woonsocket and Lowell and Manchester and Lewiston? Auburn doesn't obviously get invited to the party sometimes.
Well, that's it. It doesn't bother because at that point they mean us, like Lewiston, because only a portion of Auburn was really Franco, like New Auburn, which I usually call it the Lewiston enclave of Auburn.
Gotcha. That's cool. Awesome. Now, did you grow up with French in the house?
Actually not. So when I was born, I was the fourth child from my father, but the second with my mother. So he had two older sons from a previous marriage, and my father, if you will, is the last of his of the Martin family that were French was his first language. Sure. But for me, I grew up just speaking English until I was learning French and as we all do, is like in middle school or high school. I always knew that I was of French descent, but that was about it. I had really no references in the French language.
Gotcha. So it wasn't like, I know in my case, I would hear it during the holidays because like my grandparents' generation would all talk to each other. And then of course we always have like the pork pies during the holidays, or gâteau sandwiches for lunch at school.
So we would have like croton, and people would have tourtière from time to time, and I would hear my grandparents maybe speaking French and like great aunts and uncles. But it was, it's funny. It really wasn't incredibly present. Like you knew you were like a French Canadian descent, but that was about it. And you kind of reminded it from time to time, but it wasn't like very in your face at all.
Gotcha.
Or at least not in my case.
No, that's cool. And so you just picked it up when you got to school because you had to? Is it?
Well, yeah. So, a funny story. I have an older sister and she had taken French before, so I was just like, I'll take French because if I have questions, I can ask her. I could ask my father. It was one of those things. It was almost like out of ease. And I started in 8th grade with very, very basic stuff. Continue on in high school. And then in high school, I kind of had this, almost like identity search, if you will, about, who am I, where am I from? And then I really kind of said to myself, if I really want to understand who I am, I have to learn to speak French and I have to learn how to speak it fluently. And so I was basically taking what I was learning from school and then trying to add on to it as much as I could in my own, as whatever way I could outside of school, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And you were significantly smarter than me when I was in school, unfortunately. Because for me, having grown up with French, when I got to junior high school, all of a sudden they offered Spanish, and Spanish was something cool and new that I'd never seen before. So I ended up taking Spanish. Junior high, which means I had a couple of years, so I may as well take it in high school, which means I may as well take it in college. So yeah, isn't it crazy for me anyway that decision I made was like 12 years old meant that.
Yeah, and it had ramifications each following year.
Yeah, it is kind of wild. So you're going to high school. You're like, you know what? This French thing, I'm learning a lot. I need to learn more because I'm really curious as to my personal identity. How did it develop into something more than that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm one of those people, like when I really like something, I have to like delve into it. You know, I had to go like 110%, almost to a fault.
That's awesome.
You know, so all of a sudden I was just like, you know what? I set the goal. I'm going to learn French. I remember one time I was talking to my French teacher and we were learning Les Miserables from Victor Hugo, but in English. Okay. And I remember saying to my French teacher, I said, one day I'm going to be able to read a book like this in French. And even him, he was like, oh, you know, hopefully, but he knew how difficult.
Yeah.
And what I used to do was I used to put my phone in French. I used to play, I used to put everything I had in French. I used to like play video games in French. I would listen to the radio and not really understand anything, but just I knew that if I played it in the background, it would like have an impact on, recognizing the words later on. It would play on my accent, things like that. And then I started talking to my grandmother in French with what little I could, and then that would build on. When I would hear people speak French and like in the street, I'd literally stop them, no matter like how old they are, and I'd just start speaking. I'd make all kinds of mistakes, but I knew that that's the only way I was going to get better. And I couldn't really care if I was making mistakes. I just wanted to. I was so hungry to speak French,
Gotcha. And this is all first couple of years of high school.
Yeah, and then it got to the point that that's kind of what I was known for in high school, and not only was I doing research about the language, but I was doing research about Franco-Americans, French Canadians, French language in North America. I started like doing research and then saving it on like an external hard drive, looking at pictures, started asking around. And then there was kind of like this scholarship that I found out about where I could go to France for 2 months. Before that, I was even looking to see what kind of programs I could do. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go to Quebec. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go to France. My parents didn't really think that I was going to go anywhere, like they were just like, it's just a pipe dream. And they weren't necessarily keen on their young son going anywhere. And all of a sudden I got presented with this opportunity to go to France for 2 months. And I had to write an essay in both English and French, 2 different essays, explaining why I think it would be beneficial for me to learn French and go there, and why I deserve it more than anybody else. In other words, it wasn't said like that, but that's kind of what the gist was, if you will.
Sure.
And I tried it just thinking, why not? It's an experience. It was all out of all the United States, so I didn't really think I had a chance of winning. And then I submitted it, and I explained basically what it meant to me as for identity and other things I was doing. And then a month of silence goes by, and then all of a sudden I get a message, an email, basically saying, "Oh, Camden, reaching out to you just to say that it's between you and one other person out of all of the United States."
Wow.
And then I got one more like phone interview, and then like a week later, you're going to France.
That's awesome. And, bummer for that other guy, but yeah. No, that's way cool. Yeah, well, I'm going to pick this up in a bit, but I want to pick up on something you actually mentioned earlier, because you talked about how you started looking into like the Franco-American story history.
Sure.
Did you discover yours? Did you look in? Did you find out like where's my family from, and how did we end up in Lewiston or Auburn? Sorry.
Yeah, I had started a little bit in the sense I started asking my older brother, my grandfather. I had done a little bit of like genealogy. That was kind of when ancestry was just becoming a thing. And I really I tried it out for the first time, but I didn't have like an account, so you can only go so far. So I really was just getting like hearsay, from grandparents who they were. It really wasn't until relatively recently that I was really able to expand about who was coming down to this area. I always knew that I was of Quebecois descent, primarily from my father, and my mother was half Quebecois, half Acadian.
Oh, wow.
So I was very lucky to have both.
And you've traced all your branches all the way back at this point?
Yeah, pretty much all of them back to France. And when I'm like,
That's awesome.
Like once again, I'm pretty tedious, so I have to get like each and every single branch, and that takes a long time.
Of course.
I haven't got quite all of it, but it's pretty there. I mean, I found some pretty unique stuff.
You mentioned unique stuff. Do you have a fun story?
Well, one thing I found out was on my father's side, on one of the strands of the family, you know, if you're flying through the women's side and then that family, I found out that on some of them were coming from Acadia, and the original one that came to Acadia was actually coming from the Azores Island off of Portugal.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. And so that was really interesting. I had no idea that there was Portuguese in the Acadians that came over this way.
Portuguese.
Portuguese fishermen. Yeah.
I guess that makes sense. No, that's cool. Yeah. Something you don't expect to find when you do your research.
Exactly.
All right, awesome. All right, so heading back to France. We are now in, how are you, 16, something like that?
Yeah, I was exactly 16. Yeah,
16 years old.
Year, I just finished sophomore year, and it was my junior year in high school that I went.
Gotcha. So what do you do? First of all, what town are you in? And what are you doing for these
so
2
they
months?
sent me to Nîmes in the south of France. Nîmes.
Gotcha.
So Nîmes, which is an really interesting place because it has many facets of history, but it's most famous for its Roman history. So me being very passionate about history was so awesome. And what's interesting is the 2 months that I was there ended up turning to 2 years.
Now, how did that happen?
I got along with my exchange family really well, and they saw a lot of, they saw me really trying to go above and beyond and immersing myself. And we sat down with the school, and they said, well, okay, if you're going to be here for 2 years, you're going to have to take le baccalauréat, which is the test that all French students have to take. And so I was like, oh, wow. You know, I heard about it in school in the United States, like that's like so difficult. And I said, you know what, I'm going to do it. And they even asked me, they said, you can do this as candidat libre, which means like it's like a free candidate in the sense that it might have been a little bit easier on me as a foreigner. But I said, no, I want to do it just like everybody else, even though I knew it was going to be harder. And so what is interesting is I had to catch up on 3 months of physics and chemistry because they didn't think I was going to be there for that long. So I had to catch up on that. And there I was. That first year I did a portion of the baccalaureate. And then the next following year I had done a portion of it. And I did well on it. And I was really, really excited. It was really cool. And basically in the United States, they're just like, since you did that, you don't even need to do the SATs. You're all set.
That's awesome. Now, where'd you end up after that then?
After that, I ended up coming back to the United States. I wanted to go back to school in France, but I wasn't quite sure how I was going to work. I needed to make money, to pay for all this. So I took a year off to work. I ended up working for a local company that did customer service for people from Quebec. So I was on the phone answering, fitness programs and things like that. And I did that for a year afterwards. And it was interesting coming back from France. That's kind of when a lot more people that were of French, that speak French were coming to the area that were coming from Francophone Africa, which wasn't quite the case before I had left. And so all of a sudden I'm coming back to Lewiston-Auburn and I have all kinds of new people I can speak French with. And they kind of became my new friends really. And because my other friends from before had moved on, to different places, I went to college and whatnot. And then they became my new friends and the people that I spend the most time with to today. So we're talking about people from like Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda and Burundi and Djibouti and so on and so forth.
Is that area, because I know we've had a similar experience here in Manchester, because we were for a while in a refugee placement city. So we'd have a bunch that would come in every year. Was that kind of the same thing in your area?
Similar to a degree, or they would be coming to Portland, Maine, and then they would then come to this area because it's a little bit cheaper for like rent and whatnot.
And they found people they could communicate with.
Yeah, and they could speak French here. Yeah.
That's awesome. All right, so you spend some time doing some customer work with people in Quebec. What happens after that?
So what's happening after that is my parents are like, well, we'd like you to, stay here in the United States. We lost you for like 2 years, so we want you to stay by. And so I'm also very passionate about wildlife. So there was a school here in Maine, in a place called Unity, Maine. That's also called Unity College. I was starting to go to first semester, and it was really neat because it was doing like the wildlife stuff, and I, met some really good friends. But the problem was I always kind of felt like I was missing out on, education in French. It had been 2 years and, it was kind of difficult for me to write again in English. Not that it was difficult because I didn't know my words, but I spent so much time trying to focus, just write correctly in French that like that was all my reference, my frame of reference. And so I was really kind of like seeking out an experience where I could go back to speaking in French. And so I was working there kind of like as a student ambassador. And one of my jobs was for the person that was responsible for recruiting foreign students. My job for her was to contact different schools that had like-minded missions, green and ecology and whatnot, and to see if we could create some sort of partnership. So she gave me one day, she was like, okay, you're gonna contact Canada, and you know about Canada. So I was like, okay, Quebec. And so I was looking for places that had like an environmental based programming in Quebec, and I came across le Cégep de Saint-Félicien in the Lac Saint-Jean region, so about 3 hours north of Quebec City. So I give him a call and I'm explaining what it is, and I was explaining what kind of partnerships we were looking to establish. And he was the person I was speaking to is kind of like, okay, we would be interested, but they would need to do this, this, and this. They need to prove that they're proficient in French, and you could tell that they were used to wanting to create partnerships. And then all of a sudden, and then he was like, yeah, and it's going to cost like $185. I was like, excuse me? And he was like, yeah, $185 for the year. And I was like, Canadian? And he was like, yeah. And so he said, I said, well, now I'm gonna have to think about this myself.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So I go back home and I'm talking to my parents, and my father tells this really funny story where he comes to pick me up for Christmas break, and he's coming to pick me up, for the dorm for like the 2 weeks, thinking that I'm coming back to the school afterwards. And all of a sudden he says he starts seeing me putting all of my things that I had in my dorm into the car. And he was really, oh, by the way, that my roommate was from Manchester. He was a Pellerin from Manchester.
I'm sure he's a great guy. I'm a fan of him already. Yeah.
And so my father, he's getting all upset at me, like, what are you doing? Why are you taking all your stuff? I said, I'm not coming back. What do you mean you're not coming back? You got a great scholarship, blah, blah, blah. I said, I'm going to this school up here. I got accepted. I'm going to go there. And he was all upset. And then I told him how much it costs, everything. And then he was like, oh, okay. And then we drove up there in the middle of January of 2015. It was really cold up there. That year, it was the coldest I've ever experienced, -48. It was a really cold year that year. And then my father saw the programming I was going to have, the welcoming I was getting. And he knew that was the best choice for me. And then I ended up staying there for 3.5 years, and I got my degree in environmental protection.
You are, I don't know how they do it. You guys are much tougher than me. I could not handle -40 degrees.
I mean, you don't like spend time outside, but that's the coldest I ever did feel. It was like -30.
Yeah, I know. One time I used to get a group together, my sister and a bunch of our friends. We would head up and we would do Quebec City New Year's every year.
Oh yeah,
and
nice.
We get an Airbnb and they have the big party right outside the walls. It was a good time. And the last year I went, I don't know how cold it ended up being. I know when we left the house earlier that day, it was -27 before wind chill. And this is the story I tell everybody. So we get there and I purchase a Guinness. And I hand the Guinness to my friend Haley, and we went and used the restroom. When Haley handed me back that Guinness, it was already slush.
Yeah.
I spent $8 Canadian for 0 sips of that beer.
Because it's low alcohol content.
It's like, that is cold. That, when your Guinness turns frozen in the time it takes you to.
Yeah, I've walked home from school, which was a 5-minute walk, and the water that I had would turn to slush.
Yeah, no. Good on you. I mean, I could do it for 4 days, week. Sure. Yeah. I don't know if I could handle a month of that.
Yeah, so. It was quite a lot.
That's awesome. So now what I find interesting is you start French in school, and you really develop it in your time over in France. And now all of a sudden you're in Quebec.
You're right.
Now we hear a lot on this podcast of the, if not actual difference, perceived significant difference between the French spoken in France versus the French spoken in Quebec, and how each side can identify the other immediately, and each side has various thoughts on how they view the other side's use of French immediately. So how did that go for you?
So that's a great question. I was basically, because how can I put this? Because I spent so much time in France, and that was my first immersion contact, that's what my accent became.
Sure.
And on top of that, because I lived in the south of France, my accent, my most comfortable accent in French almost became the southern accent from France. So kind of like the Marseille accent, which is very different from, like, let's quote unquote Parisian accent. So when I came to Quebec, I knew that people weren't that familiar with the Southern accent, so I adopted a more standard French accent from France, and that was the way I spoke. And so pretty much everyone thought I was from France. I mean, I would have to like take out my passport for people to believe me, and I could roll along with it. Sometimes I would meet people in at a party or something, and they would ask me my name, and instead of explaining like, okay, my name's Camden, I'm from the United States, I lived in France, then I came here, I would just present myself as Martin as my last name, because it's a very common first name, because Camden's very hard for people from French sometimes to pronounce it. So I'd just be like, yeah, I'm Martin and I'm from Nîmes. And they'd be like, oh, it's Martin from Nîmes,
Yeah.
And then sometimes I'd just be known as that.
That's awesome.
And afterwards, if I knew that I was going to be spending time with someone, I would explain to them, okay, my name's Camden, I'm Franco-American, a French-Canadian background. I spent time in the south of France and now I'm here. However, I have kind of like a sensitive ear. And so I kind of pick up the accent wherever I am. And so I'd often, when I'd speak to people back in France, they'd be like, oh, now you're picking up a Quebecois accent. So it become kind of a mix, if you will. But depending on who I'm talking to, I try to adopt my accent, especially here when talking to Franco-Americans. I tend to take a more like Quebecois accent when talking with people from around here, if I'm talking to my family, because they're not really exposed to accents from France. And so I find it's the best way to like avoid alienating anybody, just to make sure like someone from around here and whatnot. Because, French, of course, as you know, in Manchester and other parts of New England, those who speak it, a lot of times they refer to as speaking the poor French, which is completely false. But I do that in a way so that they're feeling more comfortable, and the conversation moves a lot more smoothly like that.
That's cool. Now, I'm curious if having that experience and coming back to the Lewiston-Auburn area, was there like even a difference in vocabulary? Because that's something I hear a lot. Like I was talking to somebody from Drummondville, and I used the word meme, and he started laughing. He's like, we haven't said that since my grandparents were talking about their memes. Like nobody says that here anymore. And I've heard a lot of other stuff like that, where there's certain words that are even different that are being used now.
So Franco-American French is very similar to an older Quebecois French that was spoken, at the beginning of the 20th century. What really began to change the dialects in Quebec was la Révolution tranquille, the Quiet Revolution really changed it. And since we didn't have that in Franco-American, Franco-American, at the same time, there's that kind of that difference that created. I was in Lac-Saint-Jean region, and so it's a little bit more like rural. And so there was a lot of accents that were similar. Here, the accent in Lewiston-Auburn, the most common Quebecois accents, like from the accent from La Beauce, because it's just on the other side. That's a really common accent that came to this area. But Lac-Saint-Jean is very similar. And the vocabulary, depending on who you talk to, it'd be different. But if I talk to young people and I use like certain words from here, they would notice. But interestingly enough, most of the words, like when my father came up to visit, he could understand pretty much all of it. There wasn't too much difference,
Yeah, no, that's cool. So you're up there a few years, come back. What did you always, first of all, did you always intend to come back?
I really was happy in living in Canada. Let me put it this way. Canada and Quebec really welcomed me.
That's awesome.
As a government, as a people, and I felt really at home there. And to the point that, for example, going to school there, I was able to pay that price because they considered me as a French student from France, and that allowed me to pay the $185 compared to like the $5,000 it might have been. And so it was really, really cheap for me to stay up there. And so they would make, they were always really accommodating. Like when it came time to me file taxes up there was like solidarity credits, and it was just really nice. And I was not quite sure what I wanted to do, but I had to leave because my permit was running up, and I was thinking about coming back home, and I wanted to work in the field that I had studied. I wanted, as a young person, it's easier when your parents are nearby. So if you need help, you can count on them, as you're building out your young adult life. And so I come back to the United States and come back to Maine, and I'm like, I have to speak English again. I don't like this. Anyone that knows me, they know if they speak French, they know that with me, I'm not going to speak English with them, even if I know they can, because I don't like to if I don't have to.
That's awesome.
And so I'm coming back, and I'm kind of bummed about it, but at the same time, we'll see what comes. And I also knew that there would be all kinds of programs and initiatives I could work on also that would be stimulating. But I come back, I can't find a job in my field. They're not quite sure what I did for a program, even though it was very hands-on. It's an excellent program. So I ended up having to work at a FedEx Kinko's in the meantime. Actually, my French language did serve me quite helpful. I probably speak French almost once a week because people coming in and they need help and stuff like that, coming from different countries, especially when I was in Portland. So that was helpful. I did that for a little bit. And then I ended up getting a job at a local museum that used to be one of the major mills. Like you have the Amoskeag, we had the Bates Mill here. Not as large, but really large for the state of Maine. I think at its height, we're talking like 5,000 employees in the 1950s. So it was huge. Yeah. And so I started working in a museum that talked all about the industrial period, therefore French Canadian immigration. And I did that for about a year and a half.
Yeah, can you tell, that's the Museum LA, is that?
Yeah, correct. Okay,
yeah. Let's hype this museum a little bit, because I've never been. I need to go.
Yes.
If I show up tomorrow, what am I going to see in this museum? Why should I make it a point?
So Museum LA is really great because what it does is it mixes general history with individual people's stories. And that makes it more relatable in another way. So I was the tour guide, if you will. I'm the one who would, the visitor services guy, I would explain all the history to people. So you would walk into the building, right away you smell the old, like the smell of a mill, you see the old floors, you see the old stains in the floor. So you would come into our immediate first gallery, and that gallery is like a temporary gallery, so that would change out. And then, you would visit around there, whatever that subject was, and then I'd bring you upstairs. You would walk onto the floor and you would just look out in this pretty large expanse of empty floor where you would see the old looms that had been. And I would come in and I'd explain about working conditions. I would point out to the canal system. I would talk about French Canadian immigration, Irish immigration to the area at the beginning. And then I would talk about the shoe industry. I would talk about a variety of things. So when you're in there, you're immersed with seeing, like you can imagine the space. And I would try to, tell you how it would sound and how deafening it was, how hard it was to breathe with all the cotton in the air. Then we'd make our way around into the another space where like we had things on walls and, like a more classical sense of a museum. And then you would come into another room and we had all kinds of portraits of people up on the walls. And those are actual individuals that had worked in the Bates Mill. And we tell their story. So sometimes I'd point out to a person and tell their actual individual story about what it was like at the mill, what was their life like. And people would actually wear these little note like cards around their neck. And it was kind of, to tell someone's story. And so they could honor that person when they were walking around. And then I would talk, how the city developed, other immigrants coming to the area, the shoe industry, we'd actually get a chance to look at actual looms. You get to talk about, like, see the different processes of how like a bedspread would come to be, how shoes are made. So a very industrial sense, but at the same time, we talk about a lot of individual stories and whatnot. And I really enjoyed it. It's very rewarding, very human. It's silly to say like that, but it's a very human experience, humanizing experience.
Yeah, it seems like a place I got to visit with my mom. I got to, one of the cooler things that has happened to me in this entire, process of doing this podcast and stuff is my mom and I, we went down to Lowell.
Oh, nice.
To their museum down there. And they have a working loom room. And there was a gentleman again giving the tour and stuff. And he had a loom. He was trying to explain some of the things that I felt bad for him. Kind of midway, he kind of forgot what this certain processes was. And my mom was just like, yeah, I used to work on this machine, and she just took over. And it was like, wow. This is like the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life, because it was the exact machine she had worked on. She went to, actually her story is kind of crazy. She would go to high school here, walk across the river, and do the 3 to 11 after school.
Yep.
In the mill.
Yep. Yeah, we'd have the same shifts here as well. Yeah, it would be a 24-hour, 24/7.
You go to school, high school, and then going and working a
full-time job.
A full-time job in a mill. That's some heavy lifting.
Really difficult work, hard, dangerous.
Yeah.
No, that was the same case for most of the Franco-Americans and other immigrants here. That was their life for the majority of them.
Yeah, no, that's crazy. All right, so you leave there. What made you want to teach?
It's so funny you asked that question, because both of my parents, were teachers. More so my mom, but my father in many respects was a teacher. And I always said, I do not want to be a teacher. I just knew how much work it was, how underappreciated it was. I wanted to do other things. And turns out with this summer, what happened was I was reached out by St. Dominic Academy. They were looking for someone to replace the person that was teaching French before. And it really came at a good time because at the museum, we were suffering because of COVID. No one was visiting. We were down to 3 days a week. And it really came at had a perfect juxtaposition, if you will. So I was like, I'm not really sure about it. I know a lot about French. I know how to talk to about people. I know how to tell people about things and share it. And I'm passionate about sharing things when I'm passionate about the item or the subject. Sure. And so I said to myself, let's do this. Let's see what doors this is going to open. And I definitely have not regretted it in the least bit. I've really enjoyed it. It's stimulating, seeing the children, kind of seeing the light bulb in their eyes, awesome. Turn on, making jokes. I always enjoyed that kind of rapport with people. So it was a really easy transition, and it's cool working at St. John's because it's a former parochial school that was started. It was the first Franco-American higher than 8th grade school in all of Maine. So it was really cool, having that story and hearing some of the older staff working there and coming across families that had worked there for the first, I would say 10 years, maybe 15 years of its existence. It was bilingual, French and English.
Sure. No, that's awesome. All right. I would like to, I guess, talk more broadly, the picture of French language in Maine now. So I know that's something that you're very much passionate about. Before we get going, can you give us just a quick thumbnail history of the French language in the state of Maine?
Sure. I'll do my best to make it nice and concise for you.
Sure.
So here in the state of Maine, it goes all the way back to Samuel de Champlain and his 1604, establishment on the St. Croix Island and doing, routes, checking in different rivers and whatnot. Later on, creation of the Fort Pentagouet, which is in Castine, Maine, which was run by a really cool baron from Pau in France, and who became an Native American chief at the same time, simultaneously. Really, really cool history. So it starts there. Awesome. French and Indian Wars, Acadian expulsions, later in the mid 18th and later on in the 19th centuries, Acadians and French Canadians came to northern Maine, and then people coming as soon as the 1840s after the Patriot Rebellion in Quebec coming into Maine, and then really picking up after the Civil War all the way until about 1930 for French Canadian in terms of large masses. That kind of trickles. 1990s, we start to see people coming from Togo and other West African countries, and then picking up since 2010, people coming from Burundi, Rwanda, Ivory Coast, Central African Republic, Mali, Chad, Congo, like Gabon, sure. many like African nations speaking French. And of course, throughout that entire period, you'd also have European French speakers coming, but not in droves by any means.
Gotcha. So essentially, French has been spoken in Maine well before there was Maine, there was the United States. Yeah.
Actually, Maine, it comes from the French word Maine, from France, France's Maine province. It was actually officially voted upon that was the etymology of the state of Maine's name, that it was voted that we took the French word, the French province Maine, because when the French explorers came, they said, oh, it looks a lot like our Maine in France. So it's just awesome. Really cool.
Nice. So what do we look like now then? Because I know the story that we get here in Manchester a lot is of the declining use of the language narrative. Right. What do we see in Lewiston-Auburn?
So in Lewiston-Auburn, I would say it's it's uncannily similar to Manchester. Lewiston and Manchester, I think, are even closer as entities in terms of Franco-American centers than we would be compared to Woonsocket or Fall River, because I think Manchester, we've shared a lot of history in terms of Franco-American, people that have transited through, in terms of size. And then our two cities have really, I would say, compared to the other ones, have held on to their Franco-American identity quite well. I mean, Woonsocket has to a degree, but Fall River and these other big names, New Bedford, Lowell, there was a lot of other peoples that came there and made their names. And so here there hasn't been as many immigrants that had such a lasting impact, such as French Canadians, Franco-Americans. So today you can hear French being spoken here and there. It's not very common as it once was. I usually like to say most commonly you're going to see people speaking French either if they have gray hair and older, sure. or if they're, like I said, coming from Francophone countries in Africa. That's the majority of the French language that you're going to be hearing spoken. And you might hear that, in a store, you might hear that in retirement homes is where you're going to hear a lot of it, in the hospital. I tend to seek it out, if you will. And if I hear someone speaking like Lingala, so coming from Congo, like I can more than not, I'm pretty sure they'll speak French, so I will approach them and start speaking French to them. So sometimes people won't even speak it, but I can okay, this person, I'm pretty sure they speak French, and so I just kind of approach them and start speaking. But you have to seek it out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And I guess my question for you then, because you're heavily involved in this, is almost like a looking towards the future, kind of where do we go from here? Because it seems to me like a major piece of the puzzle is we got to get younger folks involved. And one of the things that I'm super jealous of is our friends in Louisiana have found a way to get public schools in completely French immersion. Like, is that on the radar for you and me?
It is on the radar. And it's funny that that we talk about this, and we think of it as being a new thing, but people have been talking about getting French into the school systems for quite some time, actually. Even here in New England, like New Hampshire and Maine, like even back in the 70s and 80s, there was tries for it, but it wasn't like a really ripe environment. And I would only be saying it's in the last 10 years that the environment has become fertile for these ideas. And so where we stand right now is Northern Maine. There's been, especially like Madawaska, Fort Kent, Frenchville, there has been immersion programs. There used to be for like in Madawaska, like a pretty strong French immersion program, but it's kind of like tapered out. And that's really due to not because of lack of interest, but because of funds. Here in Lewiston-Auburn, there's been after school programs as like reacquisitioning or teaching at the same time as a heritage language, but never as like a full-on immersion program such as our homologs in Louisiana. But what's in terms of radar, and I spoke about this back in December, is there's been, I got together with some people from the Lewiston School Department and said, hey, let's see what we can do to make this happen. And that was all pre-COVID time. So a lot of that has become secondary and tertiary priorities at this point, which is totally understandable. No one can argue with that. But the interest is there. It's a question of knowing who's interested in having us organize ourselves and making our case known. We're definitely working hand in hand with, the French consulate in Boston, organizations like I'm on for the Franco-American Collection and l'Alliance Française, they each kind of do their part, but there hasn't been like, and there will be, and I'm assuming in the near future, but like an actual committee that's saying, hey, we're bent on making this a reality. There's people that are interested, we're getting together more or less, but there hasn't been like a one consolidated effort, if that makes sense. Sure.
Yeah, it seems to me like our friends in Louisiana kind of have done a better job, at least than we have up here in New Hampshire, is selling the value of it.
Right.
Like making it very clear to those in public, decision-making roles that this is a smart investment if you put it in your public schools.
In places like New Hampshire and Maine, we have we even sometimes have very significant arguments such as Louisiana, because look at our commercial partners just across the border.
Of course.
Somewhere like Maine, I was actually tallying up different populations, like neighboring entities. And there's actually more French speakers around Maine than there are English speakers. If you count all the French speakers from Quebec and New Brunswick and those who speak French already in Maine and New Hampshire, there's more of them than there are English speakers. So it really makes sense for us to speak French for a variety of reasons. Here in Maine, as it would be similar in New Hampshire, A, for that heritage language that's been present for quite some time, but B, also as a language to better incorporate those who are speaking French coming, to Maine and New Hampshire at this point. And that's the kind of duality that we're looking at presenting. And as we know, bilingual schools and bilingual education is incredibly beneficial for students. I think it was either in Newsweek or the Times, probably about 5-6 years ago, they were basically saying that lack of bilingualism, so monolingualism, is the 21st century's equivalent of illiteracy.
I saw that. Yes.
Yeah. So we really need to be preaching in a state like Maine that really is based off of tourism. There's not as much industry. What's coming in though is we're seeing a lot of tech jobs and things like that. So if we had that added element of French, in the tourism industry to better welcome our neighbors from the north, but also investment opportunities for those wanting to, have an American location that speaks French would be absolutely huge, and that'd be greatly beneficial for one of the oldest states in the country in terms of demographics.
Yes,
So
no, absolutely.
It's knowing when and where and who to shake the right hands at the right time. It's knowing when to make those arguments, to who we make those arguments. And I really do believe it's possible. It's just, it's actually, in my opinion, it's all about encouraging those who are already present here that this is what they need to invest their energy in, and this is what they have. And that's probably our greatest hurdle that we have to overcome, is convincing the people that actually come from here.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, to me, when you take the tourism dollars, you take the commerce potential, it should make a whole lot of sense. One more thing, I guess, comparison I would like to draw to our friends in Louisiana, I'm doing this a lot today, is that they got together and they got themselves in the Francophonie, which was absolutely awesome. I've spoken to the gentleman who
I was so excited for them.
Yeah, and I talked to them quite a bit. And, if we're going to get representation from New England, if that was going to, first of all, we can't go as New England.
Right.
But if there was going to be a place in New England that could do it, I think it would be you guys. I think you guys would be the ones most likely. Is that on your radar or anybody else up there's radar at all?
This has been on my radar for probably the last 15 years, at least in terms of a pipe dream. It is. There's been more and more talks. I'm in talks with, the consulate, French consulate, talks in like the different organization that already exists here in the state of Maine. So like the Acadian Archives in Fort Kent, or the University of Maine in Fort Kent, the University of Maine in Orono, with like Suzanne Pinette, the Franco-American Collection here. There's all kinds of organizations, Alliance Française, that, more or less, promote the French language, Franco-American identity, and so forth. So there has been kind of this desire to cooperate, with the diversity of groups that we have, to see what we can do to meet those terms to become part of the La Francophonie. Right. I know it would require a lot of work, and there's not a lot of the things that we would need that would be in place. And one of the things is like what Louisiana has is like a school programming system. You need like more like signage, and there's a variety of things, but it's definitely there, and it's definitely on my radar. It'd be something that I would find really huge for us to be a part of. And we would obviously, we'd be the state of Maine, but I think we would be representing New England in a lot of respects.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. That's why you'd have some help outside of Maine if you guys were looking for hours to be dedicated to this, because I think it would be a win, like you said, a win for all of us. If somebody in New England was able to get a seat at that table, I think that'd be awesome.
I mean, it's the one with the French name, right? So mine is.
That's right. It's determined. It's official. Yeah. All right, well, this is awesome. This has been way fun. But before I get out, I got to ask you this one more question.
Yes, by all means.
This is a question that I get a heck of a lot. It came up even when I was doing the presentation at the University of Maine, in fact. Mm-hmm. And I'm not really sure. I think you're in a much better position to answer it. And that is, I hear from college professors of French, and they tell me that year after year, they find fewer and fewer students enrolling in their classes, and they want to know what can be done about it, what they could do, what we can do, what the answer is. And that's a tough question for me. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how you would respond to that inquiry.
Sure. So these are things that also I think about, how to especially get younger people interested in. And to answer you quite frankly, it is definitely a multifaceted answer that incorporates qualities of the American society, social economics, a variety of things. But to answer you plainly, what I would say, and this is perhaps, this is my opinion, what we need to do is we need to have young people understand, and this is universal for all languages, but here in the case of French, that French is a living thing in the sense that people around the world speak it. It is a very beautiful language that can be at the same time intellectual. It can be a silly language. It can be a fun language. And that's what we need to be presenting to people, that language is something that is lived. It is not something, and in other words, it's you learn it, but you don't learn it in the classic sense. You have to live it. And that's what, if we were able to bring that to to schools and to show, make it immersive in a way. And what I like to do, for example, with my students is I show them the equivalent of what they like, but in French. A lot of people don't realize that you can listen to hip hop and rap, you can listen to popular music, you can listen to country and in French. And I talk about music because, a lot of people enjoy that. So if I can find equivalent of that, then they're like, oh, okay. And it becomes all that more real for them. It also, I like to do is like, French isn't just oui, baguette, mimes, berets in Paris. It's French that's spoken right here in Maine. It's French spoken across the border. It's French spoken in Western Africa. It's French spoken in Lebanon. And make them realize it's a global, thriving and very lively language, and that when they decide to take the steps to learn it, which is not easy, they become a part of that. They have that luxury, if you will, to become a part of that.
Oh, that's awesome. I really appreciate it. Camden, thank you very much for joining us here on the French Canadian Legacy Podcast. Camden Martin, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I'm so happy to have been here.
Now our fathers look at us and sigh with despair, to think that everything they love we simply do not share. But the spirit never dies, our culture will survive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive.
Special thanks to Josie Vachon for providing the music. You can find more about her at josievachon.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Mike Campbell. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at fclpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at FCL Podcast for more information about the topics discussed. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this episode.